this is the more parent or student ministry specific talk, whichever one could apply to both. I'll use more parent language, but I have given a talk similar to this to both parents and student ministry leaders. So yeah, and what I want to do, I know our it'll be a little bit less formal than my other one too, if that's okay. First of all, too, I just want to ask because like I don't know many Chiefs fans back home, and I'm sorry to be talking Chiefs, but I know it's like the thing, especially this weekend. Was anyone at the game last week? Anyone in here at the game? Okay, cool.
No, we're not crazy.
I was gonna see if you still had all your ears, and you know, that was a blast to watch. It was so fun to watch, but I couldn't imagine. I saw tickets were as cheap as like super cheap, and I'm like, yeah, but you're also gonna be paying like a toe or four. But anyway, I just wondered because yeah, I knew I was in town, so
I tried to go, but I couldn't find anybody dumb enough to go with.
Well, you have wise friends, and I don't know what that says about you, but I would have been the guy if that would have been like in Nashville, I would have been the guy that was like, come on, I know it's gonna be miserable, but it's like a once in, like you gotta go. It's like tickets are $20, like come on. I would have been that friend. I probably wouldn't have gotten anybody to go with me, but okay, so we'll get into it, and I know that we're going to have a full last session of Q&A, and I want any and all of you to feel free to scan that QR code and reserve a question for that time, but I may, depending on how much I ramble, may leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end of this one, just because I know that there may be more specific questions here that maybe you don't want to ask in a big group, or that may be more just like parenting related. So I may leave some time, we'll have to see. If I don't, feel free again to submit the question for our last session, but I think when I was talking to the guys about organizing this event or whatever, I said, man, we just need to make sure to have good Q&A because social media is just such a specific thing. Like there's just so many specific contexts and situations and examples. And I get a lot of, there's a dozen questions that I always get at events like this, and I'm happy to answer them or give my opinion on them because they're important. But there's also gonna be like, my kid this, my kid that are all just very specific and unique. And so I just want to say that I'm going to try to leave a little bit of time for that if possible. Okay, so this is how social media is discipling your students or your teens or whatever and what to do about it. A few years ago, I was in the early stages of writing The Wolf in Their Pockets, and it published just about a year ago, a little over a year ago. Sorry, a little under a year ago. One of the primary audiences for that book is pastors. And because I've never technically been a pastor, I have served on a church staff as like a volunteer youth minister, but I've not had like a full-time vocational pastor role. I wanted to be in regular communication with pastors as I wrote the book, because I know that while I'll share in a minute, like I've served in student ministry for 15 years as a lay leader and sometimes lay staff member, but also mostly just like a volunteer who shows up for all the stuff. But I know that being like a pastor is very different, even than serving regularly week to week. Living in it every day as your job has a certain level of difficulty and certain challenges that come with it. So because I knew pastors are going to be reading Wolf, as well as parents, I wanted to be in regular communication with pastors about how social media is affecting their churches. Because I have plenty of observations myself as a sort of social media user and researcher, studier, but I wanted to hear from pastors like, how is it affecting people in your church? So as I began writing, really throughout the entire writing process of Wolf, I was in active conversation with a dozen or more pastors, sending them chapters to read, saying, what about this? What do you think of that? Asking them questions constantly. They were really kind of partners in writing the book in a sense. And so I was also gathering stories from their ministries just to hear how they'd seen social media impact people in their churches, positively or negatively. I wasn't just like fishing for bad stuff, because that's not being a good researcher. And so one of the main questions I asked them was, I said, how have you seen social media positively or negatively impact the people in your church? And I didn't try to sway them either way. You will not be surprised to know, similar kind of along the lines of what I said in my first talk, most of the stories were negative. But I want to share one of the stories with you now. A pastor out west told me about an interaction he had with a woman in his church. The woman had posted on one of her social media accounts that she was having a rough week, explaining in some ambiguous details what was going on. The pastor told me that someone from the church saw the social media post, another church staff member, I think the person who led their women's ministry, saw that social media post, recognized it sort of as a call for help, maybe, even though the woman wasn't saying, please help me. It was kind of a veiled call for help of like, I had a really rough week, this, that. And she was kind of looking for attention, calling for help. And she suggested, this women's ministry leader, that church leadership reach out to her in some way, just to check on her, see if there's anything that the church could do. Hey, see, you posted this on Facebook, seems like you're having a rough time. Is there anything we can do to help you? So that church staff member did it herself. And when a church leader who knows the woman, that ministry leader, reached out to her to offer help, the woman responded in a pretty shocking way. She was offended that a church leader reached out to her and tried to help, seemingly embarrassed that the church leaders saw what she posted on social media. This is on Facebook. So why was the woman offended? In short, though her social media profile is public and available for the literal world to see, she told church leaders, I posted asking for encouragement from my online community, not my offline community. The woman also expressed, my online life is private. And she said that it should not be the concern of anyone at the church. Again, this woman shared about her discouragement on a public social media account and explicitly asked for encouragement in the post. She's not being called out by her church for some rampant sin they saw or some rant about a political figure or something like that. They saw someone in their care who seemed to be in distress, and they reached out to see how they could help. The church member clearly saw her online and offline identities and lives as separate. And that kind of goes into, which I'm not planning to talk about, so I won't go down this rabbit trail, but that goes into the thing about, like, is online life real life? Because a lot of folks, when they like to dismiss social media, will say, like, social media is not real life. And that's true in that, like, people don't post their real lives on social media, right? Like, it is a curated view of whatever someone's life is. So it's not real life in that respect. Social media is real life in that what you do online is just as real as what you do offline. It's not this separate existence that doesn't count. In fact, I've written a bit about this in a newsletter a couple years ago, that I actually think so much of our offline life really is just downstream of our online life now. It used to be that the internet was sort of a facsimile of the offline world, like newspapers like New York Times or other, USA Today, would have websites that were just like posting articles they printed in their newspaper on the internet. And now it's like a news outlet will post 300 articles on their website and then pick the 100 best to put in the newspaper. It's like we're looking through the binoculars in the opposite direction now, where like offline life is more downstream of what happens on the internet rather than vice versa. So this woman clearly saw what I do online, who I am online, is not the concern of anyone I know offline. To be clear, this may not seem super relevant because this woman was not a student in the student ministry. She was a grown woman. But I think the story is indicative, frankly, of how many Christians, regardless of age, view their relationship with social media. It's separate from real life, no business of anyone at the church. At the end of this last school year, I stopped serving in student ministry for the first time since I was a high schooler myself. So about 15 years. From when I was a freshman in college, I was serving in student ministry at the church I went to during college. Then we moved to Nashville, and every church in Nashville the two we've attended, I've served in student ministry the whole time. Sometimes on staff, sometimes just as a volunteer, small group leader, etc. As you can imagine, there's been a lot of intersection over the years between my serving in student ministry and my interest in social media. These things have, related a lot. And today I just want to give you 3 overarching ways that I see social media changing students in our lives, drawing both on my experiences as a student ministry leader and as a social media researcher and author. I'm going to do my best to give some concrete examples for the overarching ideas, but you might have to fill in some of those gaps yourself. Also, I want to be clear about something before we get too far. None of what I say is really unique to students in social media. Like I said in the main talk, I really do think that boomers in big church are as discipled by Facebook as teens are discipled by TikTok. So I don't like picking on teens here. Like, they are the power users. They have a unique relationship with social media, as goes the 13-year-old girl on social media. So goes her 37-year-old mom or whatever. Like teens do set trends. As you look at how teens use social media, that's how their parents will in half a decade or so. But I don't think we should get in our heads that social media is a young person problem. So I don't like picking on teenagers. Like I said even earlier, some of them sometimes have a better social media literacy than their parents do. But I do think that they do have some unique applications, and we'll talk about those. Like I said also before, as I was just starting, I do like to have Q&A at the end of a time like this, but we'll see if we have time for that, and there's the big session for that if we need it. So first, social media changes how your students think. Multiple studies done in the last few years show that the average American adult spends 2.5 hours per day on social media. Now, that's the average American adult. So in that, of teenagers, as we traditionally think of them, not just up to 19, but people who are, middle school through high school, your 18-year-olds are going to be captured in that survey of American adults, right? Because they're adults. 2.5 hours a day for 18 plus. If 18 plus year old Americans are using social media for 2.5 hours a day on average, you can imagine that the 13 to 17-year-olds, because according to all the social media platforms rules, no one's really supposed to be using them under the age of 18, under the age of 13, though certainly they are. 13 to 17-year-olds, I would say that average is probably a little bit higher, unless their parents are really throttling, like curtailing how much time they spend. A 13 to 17-year-old is much more likely to spend higher than the American adult average on social media. So it's fair to say we can just work with that 2.5 hours a day number and assume it's a little bit higher. It is my very strong opinion that we can never overemphasize the ways that our relationship with social media rewires our brain. I got into a little bit of that in the first main talk, and I think this goes far beyond the stuff that our teens watch, hear, or post. So much, and it's a fair concern. So much of our concern about teens and social media is content. Like, what are they watching? They shouldn't be watching this. They shouldn't be reading this. They shouldn't be seeing this. And yes, those are fair concerns. We should care about our kids not engaging with content that they shouldn't be. At the same time, I think our concerns should go far beyond content. We should be asking questions beyond what's my kid seeing on Instagram to questions like, what is the Instagram algorithm doing to my teen's brain? Those are different questions. One is about the media, the content, and one is about the technology. And as we kind of reviewed in the first session, some of these tech companies, Facebook, social media companies like them, are hiring adolescent biologists and psychologists to figure out how to hack your teens' brains. And it's not just with content, it's with the sort of mechanisms behind the content, the plumbing, like what's going on. And so I think we need to, as parents, student ministry leaders, need to think beyond watch this, don't watch this, to what does scrolling on X platform, not X, but any platform, what is scrolling on a platform doing to my teen's brain, regardless of the actual content they're coming across. So the triplet cornerstone values of social media are entertainment, attention, and identity. Entertainment, attention, and identity. These three things are, of course, related. That which is most entertaining is given the most attention, and how much attention one receives has become an important part of one's identity. So that which is entertaining yields attention. Getting more attention and how much attention I receive has become an important part of who I am and how I craft who I am. And this is where specifically you can see how it affects a teenager. A lot of adults, not all, a lot of adults have a better grasp of who I am and what I'm here to do than the average 16-year-old. A lot of times I remember when I was 16, wasn't that long ago, I remember wondering who I am. Who am I? What am I here for? What am I meant to be? Not only occupationally, but who am I to be to my friends? Am I gonna find a girl to marry? There's so much identity shaping and wondering and kind of groping around in the darkness for who am I? Social media is shaping identity for teens in a way that it probably didn't for a lot of you. That which is given much attention is seen as more valuable than that which is given less attention. We see this in the celebration of content that goes viral on morning news programs like the Today Show or whatever else, or the afternoon talk shows that have been on TV for a long time. I think it's fair to say that attention is the primary currency of social media. It's kind of, the more attention you have, the richer you are, sometimes literally, and sometimes just like in your own eyes. Like you're more wealthy in your identity, even if you are more wealthy financially. We post content in hopes of accruing enough attention to buoy our sense of self in a way only recognizing the image of God in us truly can. We look for purpose and identity in attention, and young people specifically. This is why wanting to be an influencer has surpassed wanting to be an athlete or teacher or any other major occupation. So what's the most reliable way to accumulate attention and thus the most positive sense of self? It's to be entertaining, to post funny content, to fight with people, post revealing pictures of yourself, whatever it is, to be entertaining. That doesn't just mean funny or whatever, it could be any number of things. The way to get the most attention is to be the most entertaining, and that's how you can buoy your sense of self. These are the values of social media that drive the trends we see on social media. When we spend 2.5 hours a day engaging with a form of communications technology that rewards these kinds of values, it's naturally going to shape what we value, both us and our teenagers especially. When our students spend an average of 2.5 hours a day with social media, their values are going to begin to reflect the values of social media. It's much more than, oh, my teen saw this and they shouldn't have. It's, oh, my teen cares about these things, and it's directing the trajectory of their lives in ways I would never have realized. And so often, I think we can get caught up in what they should see or shouldn't see, as important as that is, that these more long-term roots of it's shaping my teen's values kind of go unnoticed. And I think those can be the more damaging things in the long term, frankly. Students who place a high value on entertainment are going to want to be more entertaining. They're going to act out in class, be the class clown, or act in sensational ways to try to make others laugh or entertain their peers. This value naturally feeds into the next one, which is attention. Attention is easily quantified and commodified through social media. We see attention quantified in follower numbers, likes, DMs, all of that. Those who get more likes, follows, views, etc. are more valuable, popular, and important than those who don't get as much social media engagement. You've never, I dealt with feeling not popular in high school, if you can believe it. Yeah, this side of me did not come when I turned 19, okay? I dealt with feeling unpopular in high school, but you know what I didn't have was a number to quantify how unpopular I was. And we'll get into teen mental health and social media, not as deeply as I would love to, but more deeply than I am right now in just a few minutes. But the fact that you can quantify popularity and acceptance with a number or a set of numbers, you cannot overestimate the negative effects of on mental health for teenagers. In that, you just cannot overestimate that. And again, that has nothing to do with the content they're viewing. That's a whole other thing. The general rule of social media is that those who are the most entertaining are going to get the most attention. So it follows that students may be tempted to be entertaining in order to get more attention and then feel better about themselves. So the third cornerstone value of social media is identity, and I'm sure you can see how, like I just said, entertainment. I want people to pay attention to me so that I can feel more valuable. This has been a feeling of teenagers forever. Popularity and wanting to be popular is not new. It's just never been more easy to get popular or easy to feel unpopular than it is today. It's always present, always in our pockets. So those are just a few ways social media can change how our students think. It really shapes their values and what matters and how they think about the world around them. Everything becomes farmable content. They may ask you to go to vacation to a certain place for the gram. I don't know if you're laughing because it sounds ridiculous or you're laughing because it's happened, but I've heard of it. It's real. So anyway, that's the thing. Secondly, social media changes how your students feel. So this is where we'll get into some of the mental health things in particular. As social media has aged and more studies have been conducted regarding the effects of social media on mental health, the prognosis is, as you can imagine, not good. It has historically been difficult to demonstrate a causal relationship between social media use and poor mental health. So I'm not a psychologist or I don't have a PhD in any mental health stuff, but I read a ton of people who do. And what I've learned over the years is that as a mental health professional and as a social psychologist, it's very hard. You have to go through a lot of hoops, a lot of obstacles to declare something causal, right? So if you know anything about statistics, and this is outside of mental health, this is just general, there's correlation and causation. Correlation is the sale of ice cream and murders go up at the same time. Was it because ice cream makes people murder people? No, it's because summer is the hidden cause of more murders and more ice cream sales. Does that make sense? Like that's a correlation, those things aren't causing each other, they're just correlated. A causation is, any number of things. More money spent by a baseball team yields more championships? Not really, but like, so, it's like this clearly causes, X causes Y, and here's how we can tell X causes Y. Well, it's really easy to say, to like find a lot of correlations, like things are related. It's weird that this goes up at the same time as this. Causation, you have to jump, as a mental health professional, you have to jump through a lot of hoops to be able to say clinically, X causes Y. You don't get to just throw that around. And for so many years, because social media is so new, I mean, it may not feel new to you, but it is so new still, it has been very hard for social psychologists and mental health professionals to be able to say, increased social media use causes poor mental health. Like they just frankly haven't been like able to say that. They would be putting their reputation in jeopardy because there hasn't been data to support it. And they haven't had to go, because you have to have like some longitudinal studies, you have to have a lot of, again, hoops to jump through. But correlation has always been there. Like you've been able to draw for at least the last decade, like in studies that have been done, especially among young people, the more time a teen spends on social media or even on their phone generally, because often 80% of that time is going to be on social media, the more time they spend doing that, the higher chance is that they've contacted a mental health professional in the last few years or self-reported thoughts of suicide and self-harm, things like that. However, in the last couple years, a few very prominent mental health specialists and social psychologists, Jonathan Haidt, Jean Twenge, and others, have felt comfortable, based on the data they've seen, to kind of put their reputations on the line and say, increased social media use it causes mental health problems. So we're getting there. All that's to say is like, there's tremendous work being done behind the scenes. And the reason that's important, even for you, is those kinds of things, that kind of work needs to be done by these people in order to actually start holding a lot of these companies accountable. Because something that I'm really passionate about, and I'm going a little bit off script here, but this is really important to me. I have a lot of conversations with parents about this stuff, and a lot of big picture conversations about this stuff, as you can imagine. And a lot of folks are like, well, what can even be done? What can even be done about mental health and social media in teenagers outside of like banning it, which wouldn't work? I'm like, well, I often say like, look, I'm not the kind of guy who's going to be like asking for more government intervention in all these different places. But frankly, I don't know what, like, parents, you as a parent, if you're a parent or grandparent you're caring for a teenager, you will not beat Facebook or Instagram. Like you're going to lose. It is a losing fight for you to try to, it's you as a parent going up against some of the leading adolescent behavioral psychologists in the world who are being paid millions of dollars to addict your teen to these platforms. Like, good luck. Like, you maybe have their trust, but that's it. Like, they have technology, they have behavioral science, they have everything they need to beat you in that war. It's going to be hard for you to win. And so I just think increasingly we need some sort of regulatory help to help parents not feel like the bad guys when they tell their teen they can't get on Instagram when they're 13 years old. Because it's just a fight that's really hard for a parent to win. So anyway, there's a ton of work being done about that. And that's a really huge deal. So without bombarding you with statistics, that's happening. What this means is the more time that one spends on social media, the more likely it is they're experiencing a mental health crisis. In fact, people who frequently use social media report greater symptoms of psychopathology, but concerns abound regarding how social media makes us feel, even beyond the clear mental health dangers. So our interactions with others on social media change how we feel about other people. Engaging with people on the internet makes us feel antagonistic toward people we don't know. This is most prominent among teenagers. Socialization mediated by the internet is so disconnected from other people that it really threatens our ability to see other people as people. Like, we just define people as their beliefs. Like, we come to, like, they're not people, they're just an avatar that holds these opinions I disagree with. And we, like I mentioned earlier in my first talk, like, we lose the image of God in other people. We don't recognize them as humans. By recognizing them as subhuman is what makes us feel able to treat them the way we treat them, or specifically our teens, to treat them the way they treat them. our relationship with social media can also make us feel like we're never successful or pretty or interesting enough. And I'm saying this for teenagers, but also this is how your teenagers feel. This leads to feelings of discouragement and discontentment, which obviously can lead, when you're 15 and 16 years old, leads you to feel like you're not enough or not good enough. It can make us feel unworthy or perhaps unworthy of life itself. The phenomenon is most acutely felt among teen girls. And I'm gonna get into that in a second. Does anyone have teen girls in here? Okay. I have, like I said, a near 4-year-old daughter and a 4-month-old daughter, and I'm already thinking about this, as you can imagine. Social media dramatically hurts girls more than boys, and there are very clear reasons for that I think are logical and proven, and I'll explain those in a second. Doesn't mean boys are off the hook, it's just girls just feel the effects more dramatically. As teens attend high school, they walk down the hallways between classes, and those hallways serve as a sort of stage. So I'm not gonna do a poll to see how old everyone is, because I don't wanna make anyone feel bad or anything like that. But when I was in high school from 2005 to 2009. Even when I was in high school, we had social media, but the iPhone, like, I reported on the release of the iPhone for my high school newspaper, right? So like most of my peers didn't have iPhones. Their parents had Blackberries. But like my friends weren't really caring, or I had one friend in one of my classes who got an iPhone, and I was like, this is the coolest thing in the world. But like, I remember writing about it in the school newspaper, like, hey, this thing might take off. At least I didn't say, I think this thing's gonna be a flop. I could have written that. But when I was in high school, even though we had MySpace and then Facebook about halfway through, Instagram didn't come along until I was in college. When, there's a social performance that happens in the high school hallway and at the lunch table, right? Like if you attended high school in the early 2000s or before, really before people were carrying around social media in their pockets, you know that you're performing when you're walking from class to class. And I don't mean performing like you're like strutting your stuff, but like that's when you're building social reputation. That's when you're building relationship. Sometimes in class, if you're talking or whatever, but at the lunch table, in the hallway, those are the social stages of a high schooler, of a middle schooler. It's where you're socially performing, for lack of a better way of putting it. But when you went home, when you and I went home, we took the bus or drove our cars or whatever, when we got home, we were in the backstage. If we had been on stage, we're now in the backstage. We could let our hair down, metaphorically or literally, put our sweats on, hang out in our rooms and do whatever, talk to our families, and unless a friend called us on the phone, and we picked up our landline, or we went to the basketball game that night, or whatever else, we were done performing until we went back to school the next day. Now, some of us maybe grew up in homes where we feel like we had to perform at home for our parents or whatever else, and certainly that's a thing. But the sort of social performance for our peers was turned off until 7:30 or 8 o'clock the next morning. Teenagers today never get to leave the hallway. They live in the hallway. There is no backstage. They can never let their hair down. Because as soon as they they feel like they can let their hair down and feel like they can stop performing, they stop keeping up. The metrics that track how popular they are stop accruing numbers. All of our teens are influenced. All of our teens want to be influencers. What a lot of them don't realize is they kind of are, but just not what they want, not to the degree they want to be. They're being influencers to survive, rather than being influencers that make millions of money and become famous. And I think what is dramatically affecting the mental health of teenagers on social media isn't because they saw this thing on TikTok or because they scrolled Instagram for 2 hours necessarily. It's because so many of them feel like they're always in the hallway and they can never leave. This concept is fleshed out in a book called Hitmakers by Derek Thompson. It's a tremendous book. And I just kind of fleshed it out a little bit for you. But there's no backstage for our teens to let their hair down. You and I, we could escape it. They can't. And I'll get to what implications that has for us as parents and people who care for young people in a minute. But I think primarily one of the things that has to make us think about is how can we just make our home the backstage as best we can? Like how can we just make it so abundantly clear for our children, for our teens, that there is no performance that needs to happen here. I love my parents, but I often felt like I had to perform at home, not for their love, but because so much, I was a first child in a home that was all about achieving and doing well, and like I wanted to get straight A's, or I wanted to be good at school, not because I thought being good at school was good, but because I was afraid of how my parents would punish me if I wasn't good at school. I had a very much of a performance mindset when I was a kid. And a lot of kids can have that, social media aside. But I think if we can recognize how much our teens feel the need to constantly socially perform and do our best as parents and student ministry leaders to create environments where they do not feel the need to perform, we will be doing them a greater service than even taking social media away from them could possibly do. So let's talk about teen girls for a second. This is very brief. Like I said, I have 2 daughters, and I'm already anticipating social media is not going to be gone. Oh, gosh, imagine. God bless it if social media was gone by the time my girls were teens. Woo! It's not going to be. So social media is not going to be gone in the next 10 years when my daughter's 13 and is being rejected getting a social media account by her very loving and caring dad. And so I've already been thinking about this. And Jonathan Haidt, again, who I've mentioned a couple times, does tremendous work. He's a social psychologist from New York University. He talks specifically about, and I didn't bring the stats because I don't like boring people with stats, but basically, incidents of suicide and self-harm among 12 to 17-year-old girls have skyrocketed relative to boys since 2012. Does anybody know what happened in 2012? Instagram really came onto the scene in 2012, and since then, incidents of suicide and self-harm among teen girls have skyrocketed, relatively speaking, gone up 7 or 8%. Among boys, almost flat, a little bit up, but almost flat since then. That's over 10 years ago now. The reason is this, and this is what Jonathan Haidt theorizes. Obviously, he can't know this, but it's as good of an explanation as any. Why does this affect girls more than boys? Does anybody have an idea? If you thought about it really hard, you could probably figure it out.
Girls fight before.
Exactly. Think about how boys and girls resolve conflict. If you've ever been in a middle school boys' locker room, we survived. And you can like breathe through the Axe body spray. You know that boys resolve conflict 8 times out of 10 with fists, with shoving each other. Maybe yelling too, but like they're physically gonna resolve conflict. I grew up with a younger brother. I beat up on him all the time. And he tried to beat up on me and it didn't work. So like teen boys resolve conflict physically. Girls resolve or perpetuate conflict emotionally, communicatively, not with their fists typically. So if you recognizing that, how girls and boys resolve conflict or perpetuate conflict, which one of those is more apt to be exacerbated by social media? The girl version of perpetuating and resolving conflict. Social media has supercharged the ability for girls to gossip, talk about each other behind their backs, backstab, make like snide comments on an Instagram caption. And the thing that's so sneaky about this, like if you have teen girls, it's not that a girl comments, you look gross in that selfie. It's that they commented aw or said something 30 minutes after it was posted instead of saying, oh my gosh, you're so pretty 30 seconds after it was posted. Like it's so sly how some of this stuff works. I've talked with some of the girls in our youth group, like it's not outright most of the time girls just being like, you're so ugly in an Instagram comment or even a DM. It's just like, it's some real sneaky, like, man, it can get like passive aggressively nasty. And so this is why it's not because girls are weaker or girls are more prone to emotions or anything like that. Social media supercharges the way girls perpetuate conflict in a way that doesn't for boys. So that's why, especially if you have teen girls, you should be aware of this a little bit more. And those teen boys, man, they're just like, yeah, whatever. Like they're so much more like aloof about a lot of this stuff than some of their more socially aware female counterparts are. So we should move on, but for more on this topic, like I said, read a lot of the work of Jonathan Haidt. Jean Twenge is another one. She wrote a book called iGen a couple years ago and just released another book on generational differences. Jonathan Haidt, the social researcher from NYU, has a literal Google document that has like 30 social psychologist contributors. That's like 300 pages long now or something like that, where they're all just like adding their research that would typically be like paywalled behind these highly academic journals. And they're just like adding this research to this 300-page Google Doc to show the causal relationship between the two. And you could go read it right now. You find the link, like you and I could go read it on Google Docs, no problem. And they're just doing really, really good work. That, though neither of them are believers, I don't think is really helpful for us. Lastly, social media changes how your students believe. A young man coming of age in Overland Park, Kansas in 1951 would have had the same general worldview as his neighbors. Given that he wouldn't have interacted with many people outside of his hometown, he likely saw the world from the same ideological perch as his barber, his parents, and his priest. Any exposure to the outside world would have come from the newspaper or the radio, reports from the broader world, or maybe the tales of a local war hero or businessman passing through town. Until he went to college, if he went to college, the most formative force on this young man's worldview would have been his family, friends, and broader community. He would have grown up looking like the people around him, thinking like the people around him, believing like the people around him. This is still the case to some degree, obviously. But a young man coming of age in Overland Park, Kansas in 2021, just a few decades later, or 2024, today, is likely to have spent more time talking to people across the globe through social media than he has spent talking to his barber, his priest, or maybe even his parents. It's unlikely that his worldview has been stamped by his hometown in the same way his grandfather's worldview would have been. Part of my day job is running a website called BibleToLife.com. We take bits and pieces of the books we publish at Moody Publishers and turn them into articles for people who are Googling for various questions related to the Christian faith or faith generally. I really view Google as a search engine. I'm not even talking about search because it's not related, it's different than social media, but I really see the Google search bar as a massive mission field. There are a lot of faith groups that spend tens of millions of dollars to be the first thing that pops up on Google when you search, is Jesus Christ real, to only say he's not, or he's not actually the Christ, or things like that. And I think Google search is just a massive mission field. So I spend about 20% of my job running a website called Bible to Life, which chops up bits and pieces of our books that, someone Googling, is Jesus actually God, may never read our book that has the answer to that. But if I can post it correctly so that Google reads it and I can run some Google ads, maybe they'll come across it and actually get truth rather than the falsehood that they're coming across at the top of their Google search bar. So I spend about 20% of my time doing that. And they're often Googling things like this. So all that's to say, there are plenty of stats that show more and more faith-curious people in the church or outside the church are Googling for faith-related things more than they're asking a parent, asking a church leader or other mentor in their lives. Sometimes that's because they trust Google more than their parent. Like, imagine a teen in your home or who goes to this church maybe. They're like wrestling with whether or not they believe in Christ or believe Jesus is God and is who he says he is. Do you think they're going to go to, and this is going to vary by the home, are they going to go to their parent who they know is definitely believing this stuff and may wonder, may judge them for asking a question or whatever? I know that I would have been afraid, even though I love my parents and I know they love me, I would have been afraid to go to my parents when I was 16 and be like, I don't know if Jesus is real. I would have felt super vulnerable about that, and I don't know, what are they gonna say? They're gonna report me to the church? I don't know how to handle this. So I would have Googled, what's the evidence that Jesus is real, or what's the evidence that Jesus is God, or that is something I would have done as a church kid growing up in the early 2000s in Indiana. That's only increasing over time. Teens are only doing that more and more. In fact, I was just I worked with a girl at the very end of my time serving in student ministry. She was graduating from school. She was wrestling with whether or not she wanted to continue to be an evangelical or convert to Catholicism because of YouTube videos she came across. Nothing against Catholic folks, but they're amazing at YouTube, by the way. The Catholic community crushes it on YouTube. Mormons dominate search. Mormons, just so you know, hire the best search engine optimization tech gurus in the world and pay them tens of millions of dollars to pop up at the top of Google searches. This is why I say it's one of the biggest mission fields. You laugh about them coming to your door. They're dominating Google search, crushing it. Catholics crush it on YouTube. Like Catholic organizations and influencers are amazing at YouTube content and explaining to teenagers why Catholic theology is correct or why they should convert, etc. Evangelicals dominate Twitter and use it to criticize each other. That's basically it. That's how we're doing in the social media wars. So anyway, all that's to say is a lot of your young people in your lives, teens in this church or in your homes, are going to Google for answers to their faith questions. And I wouldn't say like, oh no, I'm a failure of a parent if that's happening. I think it's just natural for a lot of kids to be doing that because they're Googling to help with their math homework and to research for their English paper. And why wouldn't they Google for the things that are most important to them? And so recognize that that's happening as well. It's not totally social media related, but they're going to the internet for answers to their faith questions, whether it's YouTube, Google, or a friend's Instagram DMs. So I think you should be aware. So what can you do? What can you do? I don't know where you are, where you're at regarding how you think about social media for yourself or teens. I'd be willing to guess that some of you might feel a bit defeated. I even as a student ministry leader, I've felt a bit defeated, and as equipped as I feel writing on these things, it can feel like when I was talking with the wonderful gal in the senior in our student ministry, and she would, like that whole year, like the whole senior year, her senior year, which was my last year of student ministry, last 2023 to 24, 2022 to 23 school year. She came over to our house every Sunday for 2 hours after church, my wife and I, and we just I wasn't trying to convert her back to Protestantism or tell her the Catholic stuff was dumb or anything like that. She just would come with hey, I watched this video about the Pope. What do you think about that? Or what do you think about church tradition? Or what do you think about Martin Luther? She just wanted to talk about this stuff constantly. So she'd come over for 2 hours every Sunday after church, and we would talk through the YouTube videos that she watched during the week. And she came to our house actually last Sunday, right before the snow, and she's converted to Catholicism at UT Knoxville. And here's the thing, some depending on your views of Catholicism or whatever, some people would more than that and say oh no, we lost. Hey, look, she is praying, she is engaging her faith, she is in a great spiritual community that I know a lot of her peers at college are not in. So in a sense, I rejoice very much in that. But it took me, 30 weeks of 60 hours of hanging out with her and talking just to talk her through that. And still she kind of ended up going with what she was hearing on YouTube and stuff over us. And I don't view that as a loss, but it was important to me that we put that work in, my wife and I, and kind of discipling her and working through that. But even in our conversations with her, it quote unquote maybe wasn't enough, but it was, I think, formative for her and important for her to have those conversations. So what can you do if you do feel a bit defeated or helpless or whatever? First, before I get to the actual practical things, I want to say 3 things. 1, bathe your teens in prayer. I'm sure you're doing this already. I don't like to assume it, but you cannot win your students' minds, hearts, and souls on your own. You need the help of the Holy Spirit. You can't do it on your own. And I don't mean you need other parents, though you do, and I'll get to that in a second. Please always be praying for your teenagers. They need it. You need it. Second, recognize and embrace your weakness. You cannot lead the students in your care to be more like Jesus on your own. Recognize that, embrace it, seek help in others, brothers and sisters in Christ, and the helping Holy Spirit. You cannot do it alone, so don't try. Third, this is a bit of a disclaimer. None of the following steps that I'm going to give you, the practical steps, are silver bullets. So nothing I say is going to be oh yeah, if I do those things, it'll be fine. No, absolutely not. That's not how this works. They may totally fail, but I think they are some of your best arrows in your quiver, if you will, to help influence your students when there's no doubt in my mind social media is probably discipling them more than anything else. So here's 3 basic things. First, create a culture of grace. Create a culture of grace. I talked about this a little bit when I was talking about having a backstage in your home, having a place where your teen could feel like they're not performing. Maybe you're already doing this, and that's great if you are. You probably think you are, and I hope you are. But the real question is whether or not your students feel like you're doing that. And I know parenting teens is very difficult. I know this because I have friends who parent teenagers who are like, enjoy the toddler years, and I'm like, oh no. I just want to go to the bathroom by myself, please. That comes. But no, the like, I recognize that parenting teens is a whole other battle that I have not yet gotten to. However, given that I've served in student ministry for a really long time, I've counted many teens as friends since I was a teenager. I know that it's difficult. I'm not totally blind to it, despite the fact that I haven't done it. But I think I do remember what it was like to be a teen in a home that didn't necessarily feel like it was a culture of grace. There was a lot more talk about grades and obedience than there was when you don't obey or you don't make the grade, we'll still love you. That was kind of assumed. It was not said. And I think we're not here to talk about grades and obedience and discipline. That is not something I'm qualified to talk about. However, what you do in those spaces lays the groundwork for how your teens are going to view grace regarding social media stuff. I'll get to this more specifically in a minute, but what do we mean by a culture? Like, what do I mean by a culture of grace? It's pretty simple. Is your home set up in such a way that your teen feels like he or she can be open and honest about who they are when they're at home? Remember what I said about teens always feeling like they're in the hallway. We need to make them feel like they can let their hair down at home. Make your home and your family feel like that environment. Your teens are probably starving for it. What does that practically look like? I think that could be a whole talk in and of itself, but a couple thoughts on what it practically looks like to have a culture of grace at home. It's not a matter of being soft on sin or letting teenagers get away with stuff they shouldn't do, though for certain people who think in a certain way, it may feel that way. It may be hard because of that. But I think it means creating a culture in which our teens feel comfortable being honest about their failures instead of hiding them for fear of what will happen if they do like confess a sin or say like, I think I'm addicted to Instagram or whatever. I think what I feared a lot as a teen was the reason I hid sin from my parents was not because I was so much ashamed of the sin, so much as I was afraid of the consequences of what would happen. Like, oh man, I can't tell my parents I did this because then X, Y, Z, whatever it was. I don't remember what I thought the consequences would be. Now, would my parents have still loved me? No doubt. Today, I very much believe that. But as a teenager, because I feel like that probably wasn't communicated explicitly to me, I just always kind of wondered, like, man, they get awfully mad at me when I don't make a good grade, or like if I've ever gotten in trouble at school, like I know they've kind of blown up at me. Surely if I tell them this, they'll really get upset. And so I think creating a culture of grace with your kids isn't about accepting failure, but it's about being willing to not blow up when they fail and to talk through those things rather than just blowing up as soon as they fail. And again, this is veering outside of social media a little bit, but frankly, this stuff is all related. Like you can't really have one without the other. The second thing, and this is related, is welcome hard conversations. This obviously goes hand in hand with the first thing of creating a culture of grace. You won't have to worry about welcoming hard conversations if you don't have a culture of grace, because your kid's probably not going to want to have a hard conversation. But if you manage to create an atmosphere in your home in which teens feel loved and cared for, regardless of what they're dealing with, you'll likely have the opportunity to have some hard conversations, and you should welcome those. I think it's really important for parents to realize and accept the reality that their teenagers are going to sin on social media and the internet. Like, your teenage boy is probably going to find porn. Your teenage girl is probably going to gossip about her friends and backstab them in Instagram DMs. You want to know why? Because they sin everywhere else, don't they? Why wouldn't they sin on social media? If they sin at the dinner table or they sin when they're at school, it's not like you're going to protect them from sin on the internet. It's not like it's any less sin prone or like they're going to be any more righteous on there than they are offline. Like, sin is going to happen on the internet as much as it's going to happen anywhere else. They're going to fail. They're going to not meet expectations or use it beyond when they should, or sneak their phone to their bedroom when they should be having it plugged into the kitchen, or whatever else. They're going to do these things. So just be ready for that and accept that. Now, I'm not, again, accepting it as a reality and being okay with it, very different. Like, we shouldn't be okay with it. Don't hear me say that. We should accept it as like a reality if we're going to have our kids on social media. Should your kid be on social media? When should my kid be on social media? That's a question I get all the time. QR code that one, because I'm sure everybody will want to maybe wonder about that. But if your kid's going to be on social media or frankly have a phone, they're going to step in the mud. Just like understand that as a reality, so that it's not this like if by God's grace your teen comes and says, here's how I messed up with my phone or with social media, you're not like, how could you? But here's the thing, here's what I think we may lose sight of as parents of teenagers and parents in general, is if that's not explicitly communicated, your teen will probably expect you to be like, how could you? Because they know that you want more for them than that. And so I think it like having conversations proactively rather than reactively can go a long way to helping this kind of thing. You can't do it alone, which leads me to the final step here. Always be partnering with pastors, community leaders, and other parents. Always be partnering with others in this. I already said, like, you can't do it alone, you need the Holy Spirit. Always be praying and asking for help in this. More physically speaking, always be partnering with pastors, community leaders, and other parents. We're not gonna spend a ton of time here because I think it's pretty straightforward, and you're likely doing it already. But I think social media use should always be a topic of conversation in student ministries, in neighborhoods, among parents whose kids are on a team together. I think a lot of times, and this kind of goes back to the first like big room talk, social media is a sacred cow for a lot of us. Like it is an idol. And so because of that, I think that's why we don't look at the bad stuff, because it's an idol. We don't like to talk about when we sin on social media because it's an idol. And if we talk about how we sin on social media, then we'll maybe feel like we shouldn't use it. I don't want to not use it, so I'm just going to avoid that. And so I think the less we talk about social media, the more we kind of let it rule as an idol in some ways. And so I think the more we talk about it and have it in conversation with other parents, like if you feel like, man, my 15-year-old, I gave her Instagram and I really shouldn't have, but I did, and I can't unring that bell now. So what do? Talk with another parent who's in the same boat and figure out what you can do together. Talk with a student ministry leader. You know, like there's so many, please don't try to do it by yourself. I've talked actually with like, this gets to the question of like, when should my kid have a phone or social media or whatever, which are two different questions and probably have two different answers. But I think I've heard of like church small groups who all have kids of roughly the same age decide like, all right, together, we're not gonna give our kids social media until they're 16, all right? Let's all sign this blood pact, you know? And it's like kind of funny, but I've heard it actually be very successful for parents. And again, this gets to answering a question that hasn't been asked yet, but I'm sure will be asked. And I'll probably get more into this in the main session in a few, but like that can go it's really socially difficult for a teen to not have social media. But if they're friends with a lot of kids who also don't have social media, it's huge. It's really huge. So that's why I think it is an effective strategy. If there's like, you know, your 13-year-old is friends with like 4 or 5 other 13-year-olds, and you know their parents either go to church together or they're all on the basketball team or whatever else, and you can all be like, hey, you guys want to wait? You wait? Yeah, okay, cool, we'll all do this together. And then they don't feel as socially ostracized when they don't have it. They're still going to feel it some, but they won't feel it quite as deeply as if like everyone they know has it. So that gets into more specifics that hopefully I'll probably get into in the Q&A session. But yeah, you can't do it alone. I'm begging you to not try to do it alone because you'll fail. It'll hurt you, it'll hurt your teen. Just talk with other parents, ministry leaders, coaches, and whomever else cares for your students. God is with you in this. I know it's difficult. I know no one trained you for this. In fact, let me say this, not to put any more pressure on you. Parents like me are looking to you guys, who are parents of teenagers currently, to see how you do it. I think that I really feel for people who are parents of teenagers today and have been for the last 5 years. Because you have no rubric for this. You can't ask your parents, if you have a good relationship with them, how did you do this? You can ask them how they did that with, you know, if your teen wants to drink or whatever, because, you know, they have to deal with that too. But you can't really deal with it. Like you can't go to many people and ask for help who have been there. So you're setting the course for us, for parents like me who aren't going to be dealing with this for another decade. So good luck. No, like, I'm referring to you, so figure it out. No, but like seriously, like I don't envy you guys. You're in an impossible spot. Just like your kids, they can't ask you what it was like to have Instagram when you were 16. So you're in uncharted territory, and your kids are in uncharted territory. Gratefully, what advantage I will have is when my daughter's 16 and has social media, I'll have a little bit of a reference of what it was like to deal with that, and I can help her walk through that a little bit because I experienced what it was like to be bullied on AOL Instant Messenger, which isn't that dissimilar from being bullied on the Instagram DMs. So like I have an advantage that you don't, and you're just in a really hard spot, and I think it's important for you to grieve that and recognize that. And just own it. And I hope that makes you feel weak, which then will lead you to find help and recognize that like you're kind of on your own in a generational sense and that you can't refer to how someone else did it. At the same time, I'll share, this will be the last thing I say, that I'm really hopeful for. Sometimes people say, at the end of a podcast interview or talk like this, they'll say like, man, you talk about so many negative things. Like, what is anything about social media hopeful for you? I'm like, well, kind of. The thing that I'm truly most hopeful for regarding our broad relationship with social media is that I'm hopeful that we'll get better at this over time for a couple of reasons. One, because of parents like you guys are doing this for the first time. Though social media apps will always change, like they'll come and go, and what my daughter's getting on in 10 years begging me for an account on may not be Instagram, but it'll be something else. The apps change, but like it's not going to change so dramatically that it will be totally dissimilar to what we're dealing with now. It'll still be an algorithmic feed where popularity is determined by followers and likes and all of that, surely. So I think what I'm most encouraged by is that we won't have to do this for the first time ever again. And that my generation of parents who are going to be having teens in 10 years will maybe be 20% better at it than you guys were. And not because we're better parents, but just because we'll be able to look back to you and see what worked and what didn't work. And we will also have the advantage of having been a teen with social media, which you also don't have. And so we, as parents of the next generation, have a little bit of an advantage. And frankly, I think what I'm most hopeful for is our kids who are teens today will be the best version of social media parents we've ever seen. Because my daughter, if she's a parent eventually, will have known what it's like to be a teenager with social media and will be able to come alongside her teenager and be like, yeah, I know what it's like to feel like you constantly have to perform. Let me help you walk through that. And so what I'm hopeful for is that, yeah, it might be a generation or two away, but is that so much of what we're dealing with today can be a little bit mitigated by age and experience and going through this cycle a couple more times than we ever have. Because a lot of us, depending on where we're at in life and depending on how old our kids are doing this for the first time. And I think we should give ourselves grace in that, recognize our weakness, accept it, and just start asking for help. And I think coming to things like this, not to puff myself up, but I think coming to things like this is a huge part of that. Banding together with folks in your small group or in your community is another huge part of that. And I'm just begging you to cling to the Lord, cling to the people around you, and encourage your kids to do the same. And they'll follow your example, hopefully. I'll pray very briefly, and then it'll be time for us to break for a little break before the next session. Father, I thank you for this time. I thank you so much for these parents and other ministry leaders and their care for teenagers. I thank you for teenagers and how much we can learn from them and how they engage technology and social media. And I pray that you would help us to have the humility to learn from them. And Lord, also help us have the humility to cling to you as Lord, not to try to be Lord of our life ourselves. And Lord, help us to have the humility to ask for help when we need it. And we almost all certainly do in this area. So Lord, just help us to band together, support each other, not judge each other about when we give kids access to this or don't give them access to that. And help us to all just give ourselves a little bit more grace as we try to love our students, even as they're shaped in their minds, hearts, and beliefs on but by social media and how it's just affecting them. Lord, just help us give ourselves grace, recognize our weakness, and cling to others, and also you. Thank you for everything you've given us, Lord. In Jesus' name.